Hello everyone, this is Deepak Parik, Managing Partner, Honeybee, a niche management consulting organization focused on intersection of agriculture and technology. We welcome you to this episode of Uncluttering Food and Agriculture web series. Uncluttering Food and Agriculture is an initiative in which we discuss with global change makers key issues impacting food and agriculture sector and how we can make this sector environmentally sustainable, financially inclusive, efficient, and fair. We try to understand how these global transformative leaders view current food and agriculture ecosystem and what is their vision for the sector going forward. Today, our area of interest is transparency and trust in our food system. And we have a foremost expert on the topic with us, Raja Ramachandran, CEO and founder, Ripe.io. Ripe is building a long-lasting trust and confidence in our food supply chain through a platform where everyone can access transparent and reliable information on the origin, journey, and quality of their food. It is transforming food system narrative by leveraging connected technologies such as IoT, cloud, algorithms, machine learning, and blockchain to help solve large global problems around food. Working with every actor along the food supply chain, Ripe is creating a world in which access to data equals brand integrity, transparency, security, and better food for all. Now, coming to Raja, he recently was part of early founding team and managed the product development function at R3 CEV or R3, a leading distributed ledger technology firm who created iconic blockchain platforms Corda and Conclave. Prior to R3, Raja had a successful foreign exchange trading career, managing electronic trading and execution platforms and led regulatory implementations over a 20-year career at Bank of Boston, Citi, Silicon Valley Bank, and Wells Fargo. In addition, Raja helped co-found and was CEO and led two venture-funded startups to exit. Thanks, Raja, for accepting our invitation to participate in this web series, Uncluttering Food and Agriculture. Floor is yours to tell us a little bit more about you and the great work you are doing.
Deepak, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and that's quite an introduction. I'm a little more than flattered. Thank you. So, right, we're about almost 4 years old right now, and we've had quite a journey. My co-founder and I, Phil Harris, and our team, Phil and I were in the financial trading area. And so we got interested in Bitcoin probably in sort of 2014, 15, but really tried to understand what blockchain really meant, like ledgers. And he actually worked at NASDAQ at the time, and I ended up joining R3. And that's where we got to learn quite a lot about what these technologies mean and what their implications are. And so we had a very good expository run in both of our respective, roles. And then we thought there could be better use for ledger technology. And so we've evaluated a number of other verticals like cars and entertainment and law and insurance, just to see, what would fit. And we were introduced to a group, that were doing what was called the Internet of Tomatoes project. And what it was is an IoT group where they were tracking live conditions information on tomatoes. So things like in-field, farm data like air temperature, humidity, sunlight, etc. And then they also had a spectrometer or a reader that you could actually figure out the chemistry of that tomato so that you could map all of that data. And then you could predict, what the flavor of that tomato would be. So through that process, that's how we really began we learned quite a lot from that whole sort of experience. And then we ended up getting our first customer, a company called Sweetgreen, a fast growing restaurant in the United States. And so it allowed us to really start mapping all of the activity and the data that is pertinent against, from the seed of the tomato to growth, harvesting, transportation, any cold chain, delivery, etc. And so that really established the base, for one, does blockchain actually really make sense? And we found, certain instances it really does. And it allowed us to actually start looking at traceability models and also really try to understand what constitutes the quality of that food. And so fast forward 4 years, we now have a number of different customers in different produce sectors, from beef to pork to dairy to fresh produce, fairly soon some new commodity types that might include feed. And also our use cases have expanded from way beyond traceability. It really is quite a lot about quality assessment and what constitutes the quality so that you can map it to things like improvements in purchasing management. But I would say that the most of our activity today is around sustainability. In other words, how do you prove sustainability? And so our platform is slowly evolving to become that proof of sustainability, where you get assertions about, animal welfare or reductions in fertilizer use or GHG and so on. But people want to know that it's more than just a self-assertion. It's rather you can actually showcase that these things are really happening. So it's an exciting area for us right now. So no, I'm happy that we've got a phenomenal team of technologists, supply chain specialists, farmers, and so believe me, it's not me. It's really our team that does quite the work and provide the credibility that our customers rely upon.
No, that's really awesome journey, and a very important part which you talked about is the environmental factor of agriculture. We all know that 70% of groundwater withdrawals is because of agriculture. 30% of GHG is because of agriculture. But unfortunately, we always don't want to talk about it because we believe that because the farmer is in place, you shouldn't feel right the bad about that. We are talking about all these things. But as you said, sustainability and the measurement of sustainability, benchmarking, and the giving, I'll say that very clear documentation of that to create that trust that those activities which we are talking about has happened, or if we say that we have saved water in cultivation, that has happened. Do you think that actually, the overall ecosystem is ready to absorb the cost of recording as well as also that creating the proof around it?
It's a really good question. I mean, the simple answer is they have to, right? This is not an option. And so, whether they're ready or not, the market forces typically play out no matter. So if you're asking, is it early and people are not, yeah, sure, no one's ever ready to absorb, an external new cost into the system to create a new equilibrium for activity and pricing and so on. That said, I think the drivers of what will help that adoption, and we're seeing this with our customer base, it's really by two things. It's for the larger corporations, it's shareholders and investors. They're the ones that are actually really looking at getting accountability of not only your statement of a sustainability plan, but showcasing and evidencing truth of the matter. And so in that sense, that's a very, very strong driver because, a CEO of a large company is going to have to react if BlackRock or, State Street or some big fund is rotating you out of their holdings. So that's one. The other is probably the more obvious one, but I'd say it's the more cloudy one, which is consumers. This notion that consumers are also driving the level of transparency. They're pointing their spending direction into produce products that, have a good footprint in a sustainability manner. But I think the problem is that it's very difficult to translate the entirety of sustainability on a simple package. It's, yes, you may have a badge or this or that, but the reality is that when you dig beneath, there's quite a lot there because there's too many components that actually constitute, the sustainability of a product. Like you mentioned, I mean, there's water, there's fertilizer, there's land usage, there's animal, medicines and on and on and on. There's all these things. So I think the consumer story is still to, evolve. And, I think that right now that you're beginning to see the adoption of methods to track information, assure that information is truthful. There's some transparency about it. And there's incentives that actually point at, if I can prove out real reductions in one sector or pillar of sustainability, whether it's in carbon or GHG or animal welfare, then you're seeing investment move in that direction. And I also think that banking and financial institutions are starting to grow new products and services so that it can actually fit against sustainability measures and not traditional lending against agriculture, for example. So, yeah, so I would say that, to your answer, the long answer to your question, that is it ready? Yeah, kind of. I'd say it's more a function of it's inevitable. And I think most participants are starting to understand that. I think at the farmer level, it's a little bit more complicated, because I think you'll find quite a number of farmers that have already instituted sustainable measures. It depends on the produce type.
Perfect. No, actually, like, today we are having the World Environmental Day, right, being celebrated across the globe. And sometimes you feel like, worried that actually, like, the end consumer is still not valuing, right, the good sustainable practices of the farmers and ready to pay a little bit more of doing the traceability. But at the same time, because I am a practitioner in this field, like, across multiple countries, if you just put bare, transparent structure of agriculture and food ecosystem in front of the end user, believe me, he would be ready to pay anything because he'll find what is the mess it is in and what they are eating, right? What are the dangers, right? They are facing if it is not tracked, traced. This brings me to a little bit like I'll say that digging a little bit deeper. Do you think that in case we are collecting so much of data, right, and which is validated, right, because of the type of technologies which we are using, do you see that there would be a market to monetize this data also for farmers? So maybe future, not just sowing the seed, he'll also sow the data for which he can get money. Do you think that becoming a possibility, monetization of farmers' data?
Well, I think over the past 3, 4 years, several years, we've definitely witnessed many attempts to monetize for the farmer the data. And I think that will continue as a trend in the future. I still think it's early days, but there are a number of companies that monetize farmers' data, but I think it's mostly for their own licensing costs and their own databases and their own services. For the farmer itself, I think that there's efforts right now so that you can actually improve existing invoicing if you prove out, say, sustainability purchasing. I mean, the dairy industry in the US, for example, a lot of yogurt companies, for example, will pay a premium if you follow certain methodologies for dairy farming that meet their sustainability goals. And so, so do they pay an extra penny a gallon, for example? That goes to, supposedly that's going directly to the farmer. But those are very, very early, in days. Now, I think that what ends up happening is that need, there's three things I think they're going to really define that, right? Number one, farmers have long complained that, well, it's my data, I'm happy to share it, but do I create more revenue? Do I create more sales? Is it a benevolent channel? Is someone trying to price me to zero? If I can get good answers to that, then they'll share. But if not, they're very skeptical. And then the second part is, it's challenging, right? As you're in this business of getting farmers to contribute information. They're busy. They're not exactly set up in many instances for technology and labor and methodologies to produce the data. So if we figure that piece out, which, I think a number of companies are doing, including us, that digitization then gives them the first claim to that data, right? Because then establishing on a blockchain with a specific identity all of a sudden says, well, that's my information. Therefore, the next step is, well, how do I control it and utilize it? So in a sense, I think blockchains could be a really, distributed ledgers could be a really good mechanism for them to create, direct ownership or attribution of that data. And then also the sharing of it. Then that's what ledgers are meant to be, is that you don't have a central authority that figures that out. Rather, they figure it out with their relationships. I think that's evolving. And once we get to that place, you're definitely going to see, improved ways in which you can monetize the data, whether it's through a smart contract, improvements in sort of conditional based purchasing, financing vehicles that actually say, oh, if you give me live in-field information, iBank will, think through, well, how do we improve our working capital lines to you? What's our pricing look like? Should we segment products based on this? Insurance companies will look at it too, and less on actuarial tables, but rather what's actually the real data coming through, and will they recognize that in it? So it's not just necessarily direct pricing components that get monetized, but rather quite often it's the indirect cost that really is the cost of capital to the farmer. And if that gets improved, that's also a significant piece, because if they improve their cost of capital, that reinvestment back into the farms or technology or machines are all there, because you have a vast array of new things that are hitting farms, from robotics, and they have to solve for labor shortages, and certainly climate change and so on. So no, I do think that you're going to see a big push, to enable the farmer, to get direct payments. I think the carbon credit credit markets is one aspect of it. I think there are better ways to ultimately help the farmer really understand the value of their data, and I think that that's probably the primary goal. If we stay focused on that, like we'll get better market opportunities, not only for them, but other third-party services that help that out.
Cool. No, that's a pretty very well defined answer. What I strongly believe is that when we talk about additional revenue generation of the farmer, I believe that is going to become very important, because otherwise you get into inflationary circle where actually, because the farmers are sustenance in most of the part of the world, we need them. So for them to continue, they'll have to start making more money. Now, if that more money start coming only from food as a product, right, then we all are then for a major transformation or major disruption. So definitely we'll have to find other ways to monetize and give farmers, because very recently I was reading a report that for a $8 to $9 trillion of food and agriculture market, the negative economy associated with it is close to $5.7 trillion. So this industry is creating far more negative than any other industry in percentage terms. So we'll have to change that. Now, going forward, how do you see DLT or the blockchain, right? The transparency they bring on the table, right, would be adopted by the sector? Which other players do you see, whether it would be the regulators, whether it would be the governments, or only the corporation for their permission own blockchains? So where do you see this market going and adoption happening?
I think it's a little bit of everything you just mentioned. I'd say over the past 3 or 4 years, there's a lot of the larger corporations, the big food names, whether it's a Mondelez or Nestle or a Walmart or whoever it might be, say in the United States and even in Europe and Asia too, particularly out of China. There's been a lot of testing of blockchain. And so I think many of the innovation groups of large companies have now understand it, and even business units do too. So what's been recognized is blockchain isn't exactly the end all be all for, say, supply chain management. It is a component of such a thing. And so now I think the larger companies have figured out how best to use it. I think the farm side, the supplier side, is less exposed to it. I think they've had plenty of experience. Well, I don't want to generalize, but the folks that have participated in pilots, really now understand, is there a value in participating in a blockchain-based supply chain traceability effort and so on. And so the challenges to adoption really are data capture. How do I enable that piece of it? I think the biggest problem is the language of food. In other words, I call a sow, or somebody calls it quite differently, or even corn, right? There's different nomenclature that's constantly associated with all of it. And so there's this screaming for standards, which is important, but in some sense, coming from the financial trading industry, even standards there are starting to be more flexible, where you get technology that uses reference databases that talk to, say, what the farmer calls something versus the distribution company, the packer, the retailer. And the idea is that you want to enable any of them to utilize their methodology. If they use data standards like GS1 or EPSIS or whatever they use, that's fine. But if they're not really ready, capable of integrating that, then the key is going to be translating it. So if Starbucks wants to, do something around particularly coffee bean management, but they speak in a different way because they're global and their farmers have their own ways to do it. Their sourcing is quite different, but yet, as they, look to the supply chain, well, how do you infuse their language of coffee to everybody in that supply chain? So I think that's probably a big trend right now, is to figure out, well, how do you solve for that? So that's one. The second piece, for the institutional player, the large companies, they're very reliant upon things like lot IDs. Because scale is there. And so you have all these different IDs, and GS1, I would say, plays a solid part in it. But for the medium to small farmer, they don't have that. A lot of them necessarily don't have barcoding technology or RFID tags and so on. And we're actually in the middle of a huge project in Belize, transforming the sugar industry. And we're literally packaging all that in one spot. So I think that those are significant pieces to adoption. There's also this question mark about cost. Who's going to bear the cost of all of it? Does the farmer, is it unilateral, like just the big retailers and food companies? And I think that's a bit of a problem because in the end, everybody plays a part in how your food is, generated, sold, and consumed. And so why should there not be a shared cost for the implementation of this if the benefits are things like food safety, prevention, improvements in quality, proving out sustainability. I mean, who doesn't want to pay for those things? And I think the consumer ultimately, at least the ones that are able to are sort of price inelastic, the Whole Foods customer and so on, they can afford it initially. So I do think that these are the kinds of things that, are there. And I think a lot of adoption will come probably initially from all the larger companies. But I also think that big associations, and I'm speaking mostly in the United States, they're really looking at, well, what's the farmer-driven solution for, all of this data aggregation and ultimately monetization. So we're experiencing that with companies like the National Pork Board, and we're talking to a couple of beef cattle associations and Western growers and so on. And so at the association level, they're representing the farm base. And I think that's a good balance towards the commercial needs of larger institutions that need this data and that transparency. So it's still early days, and blockchain, I think now is, in the end, people want to make sure that it's interoperable. And so we're working with GS1 in a phase 2 of a project where we've been working with IBM's Food Trust, SAP, FoodLogic IQ. And so it was originally tech vendors or tech providers, and then the phase 2 is a number of commercial entities in the seafood space. So that report will come out shortly, and it will show how data standards really play a big part in helping against that like adoption, but a lot of work to do there.
Right. A little bit of again, digging deeper, because you talked about SAP and you talked about IBM. Do you see that the cannibalization of blockchain market will also happen? Just like, what happened to internet, there are few companies which are dominating, right? So do you see that also happening? Because that even now the business logic layer is also now moving towards the platform rather than where there was a lot of opportunity for the mid-size or small companies to enter there. So do you see that also, that this market consolidating itself, and then the large tech players will try to dominate, even the business logic layer as well? Do you see that happening going forward?
Oh, yeah, the reason I'm pausing, because that's a loaded question in the sense that, yes, I think if you look at historically, how technology companies in the past, say, since 1990, when the first real stage of the commercial level of internet, has come about. If you look at the evolution, typically you had telecommunications companies, and then if you look at them, you're right, they ultimately consolidated to the large telecom players, BT and Verizon and so on. And then the web component of it enabled really a whole level of commerce services. And so did that consolidate? Not exactly, but yes. Is Amazon not the largest player and so on? Sure. So there's that piece of it. And who's behind it all are these large tech companies. Now, that all presumes a centralized version of that implementation, even though the internet's widely distributed. In blockchain, it's to be seen what the real effect of a distributed ledger, meaning you've disassociated a central authority to do so. Now, all the big tech companies have blockchain services and so on, and so they're always going to become a part of it. The issue becomes, well, is there an Amazon that's going to come out of this? Is there a pets.com? In other words, are there services with brands that focus on, say, food or maybe other sectors as well? It could be airplane parts, it could be shipping, any of those kinds of things. So in that sense, I'm curious, because the other wild card in blockchain activity is this, new and growing cryptocurrency market, and NFTs and things like that. And it's to be seen how they play a part in all of it. I think the DeFi component of blockchain companies will become a very serious part of any kind of industry, because people that in the next 5 years, DeFi will become a very commonplace thing, in my opinion. It's just happening that way. So I don't know. I mean, look, IBM, SAP, all the big shops, Oracle, they're all going to have, a part to play in all of this. I think it'll come from their existing, ERP implementations, some kind of middleware that's already there. And I think those are areas that I think could be changed because blockchain in a certain way, doesn't need to be fully integrated into an ERP. It could be just a function of a ledger layer that allows you to consume and contribute data based upon the food supply chain activity where that central system doesn't dominate the whole thing. So I think in the future, certainly, IBM's Food Trust will be there, all the ERP systems, but then also there's just a huge surge of companies like ours, that are looking to become, the service as part of it. And so the technology is not singular, meaning blockchain isn't the only answer. There's a lot of other components that have to be built in so that you become interoperable in the world and you get connected. But, does Amazon play a big part of it through its Whole Foods? Sure. So I do think that it's to be seen who those players are, but I think they're the ones that are already there are pretty obvious. The big retailers, e-commerce retailers, and the big tech companies. But like anything else, there's plenty of room for, an independent new type of company as long as the value proposition, hits across either the entire supply chain or one segment thereof.
Perfect. Very well articulated. And a little bit diplomatic as well. So that's we are in a great time, like the FI or the NFT. In fact, so interesting. Like blockchain is the area. Every morning when you read about it, you find something new and interesting has happened. Right? Not just the price of no interesting thing in it. So that this brings us to the last section of our session. Here, I would like to understand your vision for your organization about the food and agriculture ecosystem and the sustainability initiative globally all together. So, we can just shed some light on this in continuation organization to the world around us. That would be awesome.
Well, sure. I think our vision is what we say in that statement. It really is about transparency, and I think it's one of those terms that really don't have a lot of people are like, well, what do you mean by that? Well, I think what it really means is that if transparency can improve upon some of the supply chain problems and woes that are out there, food safety, food wastage, sustainability, and so on, right? These are all elements that people desperately want to solve for. And they're enormous problems. Hundreds of billions of dollars that are gone wasted as a piece of it. So our idea is that, we'll play a small part in really enabling, the farmer and the suppliers to be able to trust the data collection and the data sharing so that they have channels in which they can share that information knowing full well that they have trusted parties that value that data and not use it as a competitive means to shrink down their pricing to zero. So I do think that that's one real piece of it, because if you do that right, then adoption, is the thing that's actually achievable, because you can get critical mass. And in the end, the suppliers have to trust you. And we've always leaned that way, right? We've got credibility in that space. And that's really kind of our key competitive advantage. So I think that's the first step. So traceability isn't the end all be all. I think it's an important factor of it all. What we're learning is that when you look down to it, supply chain efficiency and then quality of product, and then, valuing the quality properly is really where I see a lot of what we provide. And then the last part of it is this whole notion of proving sustainability. So those are our three core parts of our product and platform. Is that you join the system and you can quickly set up your supply chain network, produce types, and start tracking. But more importantly, we have that translation. We call this thing the food library. This is our master reference data library that allows us to translate how Starbucks or Kroger or any big brands, how they talk to their supply chain without necessarily asking them to modify what they do. And so, we're trying to make communication a lot simpler and more streamlined. That you join the system, you should be able to go ahead and connect without a lot of customized work. And so if we can do that, that too also creates better adoption. And then the last piece, if we have all of this data, it's not ours, it's all of our customers, right? The idea is ultimately that insight is incredible. We've seen so many ways in which our customers go, oh, I didn't know that, or I had an inkling that that's true, but to actually have evidence showcasing it, because we never captured that data, or we never correlated that data, with are existing. And we're experiencing that with our strong channel partner group called Neogen. They have a huge genomics database, and they have a lot of food safety and diagnostics tools. We're digitizing that so that it becomes part of the traceability record, which then feeds into sustainability. So for cattle, for example, we have a digital ID of a cow, through RFID tags and actual digital signatures that come from the DNA, from breed, stock, and so on. And then also a lot of the safety aspects. And then we also have a collection of data around the performance of the cattle as they grow and so on. And so by adding all of this, we're finding that we can really enhance the data record so that the value of that all of a sudden leads into the more critical aspects of, how about animal welfare? What about medicinal, issues? How do we calculate the cost of healthcare for things like that? How do we deal with improved ways to manage, crop production and so on? And so those are the kinds of things that we see as long term, and what's happened is they're all in silos. And we're saying that, all right, in our little world of the slice of food and ag, if we can provide a comprehensive data set that people can talk to easily and communicate, then all of a sudden you get your transparency. You now understand the food supply chain, the activity, the produce, but then also you can apply measurements so that it fulfills against commercial goals. And then ultimately, we rely upon brands to tell that story to the consumer. We don't get to the consumer because the consumer is quite hard to figure out. But brands should know what they need to do. And so all this new information and insight should become part of the new story that's there. And then last, you asked about regulators. The FDA and EU and, they're all pushing for this. In fact, there's a new FDA sort of effort around no or low cost ledger technologies or ways in which you can manage traceability. So I do think that regulations are definitely going to be a part of all of it. And so that's easy enough to implement because as long as we understand the regulation conditions and criteria, you can codify some of that. So anyway, I do think that we want to be able to be the system that people can rely upon, create trust because of the relationships that you have on a peer-to-peer basis or peer-to-many, as opposed to having a central administrator manage all of this. And that's where we see our position in the marketplace is effectively kind of like this universal capability to distribute knowledge and insight and ultimately, the activity so that people value those transactions properly.
Perfect. Very well articulated again. Actually, I see one thing, the clarity of your thoughts are just awesome. Believe me, generally what I've seen is that agriculture being complex, people have to connect a lot of the dots in their mind, right? But in your case, I can see that clarity is just super crystal. And maybe the seeds you have sown a few years back are ready to ripe for harvest now. So thanks a lot, Raja, for this very interesting conversation. And for you and the audience, we would request, in case you have time, please join us on 15th of June from 9:30 a.m. GMT for the Agriculture Blockchain Web Summit, where we'll be having a lot of interesting speakers talking all the way from Australia to US, their perspective about blockchain and using it in agriculture. I would just like to congratulate you for the great work you have done and look forward to have more such interesting conversation with you, as well as participate in your vision somewhere if we can. Thanks a lot, Raja. Have a great day.
You too. Thanks, Deepak, for having me. I appreciate that.